Before joining the Air Force, Tom had never been a morning person. Regardless of the reasons, officers' training school had broken him off the habit of sleeping in, and simultaneously imbued him with a virulent hatred of Guns N' Roses. He'd entertained no doubts that being woken up on day one with Welcome to the Jungle blasting in his ears had everything to do with it. But regardless of the cause, the effects had been permanent. He'd unwillingly become a morning person. That didn't mean there wasn't a lot to be said for being a morning person, and part of it was the peace and quiet of starting the day with no one else around. As long as you could escape the comfort of just laying in bed, there was a solace enjoying the peace and quiet that late nights afforded, without all the weariness. With hours to go before you had to head over to Bherdin's place, Tom settled down on the couch with his omnipad and a cup of coffee, and swiped open the news. Stories were all over about the return of the fleet, the absence of the Empress, ending the official period of mourning, and the start of Ithrovi. Tom swiped past them all and opened his personal search page. PSPs were dangerous things, and the Imperium had regulated limitations on their use. Tom didn't mind in the least. If you relied on them too heavily, you ended up in your own echo chamber when it came to the news, but they had their uses. In this case, it called up a spectrum of stories he had interest in. There were the usual glut of stories coming from Earth. The governess of the Sol system, Princess Katria, had shown a track record of success over the years, with the first tiny droplets of humans entering the Imperial military becoming a trickle. She'd become a champion of veterans' rights, and her initiative to acknowledge former members of human militaries were bolstering her popularity back home. Backed by one of her aides, an up-and-comer named Georgia Maloney, Katria was advocating for imperial recognition of former human awards and decorations. Worrying them after the invasion had been considered treason, then gradually reduced to a fine. Given that he copied his own for the preterm dance, he couldn't complain. But the whole thing seemed stuck in committee. Fuck it. I'm wearing them on that damn warden's uniform, and if they don't like it, I can quit. It's a win-win. Frustrated by the whole thing, Tom swiped the news closed and reopened Jama's monograph, pulling up Chapter 2. The study of rocks and early artifacts progressed to an evaluation of galactic civilizations and creation of an archaeological record. Communal groups passed away to settlements and artifacts developed. At that point in time, species went from natural enclaves to settlements. The first division of labor happened, and across every species, their archaeological record changed forever. Pastoralism and agriculture led to more reliable and abundant food supplies, increasing the population and leading to a deeper specialization of laborers, artisans, warriors, and the development of elites. Nobilities formed and civilization took off, at least in most cases. While even second-hand records were incredibly sparse, what happened with the Ulnus was just weird. Tom swiped open his notepad and jotted down entries of Tel Quarmel and Göbekli Tepe before carrying on, and found himself drawn in when he heard the sound of movement. He looked up as Solani slipped out of her bedroom. Clad in just her nightshirt, she closed the door behind her and gave a shy smile on her way into the kitchen. He enjoyed the view briefly, and it was followed by the sounds of rummaging around before the hot chocolate maker came on. It was one of the first things she'd wanted to learn, and she'd all but planted a flag on the device after being shown how to use it. Note to self, ask about more hot chocolate mix. She padded out of the kitchen and looked at him uncertainly. Mind if I join you? Guess I'm not the only morning person, and that's not a question you ever have to ask again. Tom waved a hand about the hotel room for a moment and moved over. How are you feeling? Solani slid in beside him, resting on her back, and grimaced at her shoulder. This itches like crazy, but only 2 more weeks. That's keeping the nerve stimulated, right? Tom canted his head. Solani had rolled herself into a ball on the couch, cradling the oversized mug pensively. Rough night? You don't look happy. I'm not. Biona wrote a letter to Carla's family for me, but I still reviewed it before sending it to them. She set the mug aside carefully. There's not a lot I could tell them except that she died in action. At least it sounds better than car accident, you know? Anyway, she's been sent home, and Vaco is considering retiring. Solani kept her voice down, as the house was still, but her sigh was heartfelt as she curled a bit tighter beside him. I'm losing my pod. Maybe she'll change her mind, Tom offered, studying her face. Message her later. You haven't had any time to visit. Maybe. Solani nodded, taking another pull from her mug and scrunching into the couch. Do you mind if I just sit here? Like I said, you never have to ask. He offered her a tentative smile. Anything else you, Miv, and Leia can figure out for yourselves? That got a bit of a smile, and he settled back into the monograph. Solani arranged herself and closed her eyes. He felt one leg brush up against his, but otherwise, she just seemed to relax, and he turned back to his omnipad. So division of labour was followed by social specialisation. There were variations, but the interesting part was his analysis on what made civilizations really take off. While nascent civilizations could achieve a high value of culture, with writing and art and literature, technology was another matter altogether. Societies thrived along worlds with fertile valleys, but technology thrived on worlds with islands. Tom sucked his teeth on that for a moment. It seemed to be a very shore-centric point of view, but the data from worlds he'd never even heard of backed the statistics, and in its own way, so had Earth. The Egyptians, the Chinese, the Indus. Countless civilizations had risen where fertility allowed excess, but while there were exceptions, those societies frequently turned inwards, protecting the largesse that enabled them to thrive. Technology, on the other hand, seemed to be a response to scarcity, and civilizations like the Greeks, the Phoenicians, and the like seemed to have a leg up, turning outward for survival. Separated from one another, problems were solved by a multiplicity of solutions, and in time, technology. It wasn't a universal rule, but it was a rule of thumb. Provided a civilization didn't suffer too grave a setback, a bit of adversity encouraged creativity. Tom bit his lip and made a note about the Akkadians. How many times had early civilization risen on Earth just to be wiped out? The Akkadians? Earth's first empire was wiped out almost without a trace by a drought of biblical proportions. The Mycenaeans? Wiped out by earthquakes, followed by invasion. How many times and how many others? In comparison with the rest of the galaxy, Earth's natural environment had all the charm of the Darien Gap, multiplied by the Australian outback. And maybe they're right. Statistically, Earth is a lot more dangerous. What if the Akkadians hadn't fallen? If the Greeks hadn't been dismissive of applied knowledge on a large scale? Would we have met the Shilvanti out in the stars? Tom regarded the long purple leg draped alongside his, and the woman it was attached to, as she sipped her hot cocoa. The book of love is long and boring, and written very long ago. It's full of flowers and heart-shaped boxes, and things we're all too young to know. Peter Gabriel crooned out in the back of his mind, interrupting his thoughts as he regarded his fiancée. She was younger than Miv and Leia, younger than him, but as she lay there beside him with all her bruises and bandages, it didn't matter in the least. He spent a long moment looking at her, taking the moment to cherish before returning to his notes. Doesn't matter, I suppose. We're here now. Tom rubbed his foot along Solani's, and she gave him a soft smile. It really was something he wanted to see more of. Humans might have gotten set back, but we're pretty good about spreading out once you give us space. Bherdin woke and glanced over towards Brelak. There was more than enough room in his Empress-sized bed for the two of them, and the man had been shattered after the long trip. Slipping on his robe, he tugged the sash about him against the morning chill, and crept out of the room without a sound. With Vedeem gone, the house didn't feel like itself, but the one thing that would help was making breakfast. There would be time for all the hustle of the day that Thry'sis was sure to bring, but getting up and cooking always made him feel better. There was a comforting routine to it that never failed to... Bherdin blinked the sleep from his eyes as his mind caught up. There were sounds coming from his kitchen, and he bustled through the inner hall and into the room. There are humans in my kitchen! Where I found the coffee. The human elders, Jennifer and Zachariah, had gathered around his cook table with various things laid out and about. Jennifer spotted him first, acknowledging him with a wave as she spoke on her omnipad. Oh, gotta go. Mr. Tshirt is up. Talk soon. Good morning. There was an art to make every guest feel comfortable, and Bherdin checked his robe was properly tucked in as he smiled. I hope that you slept well? Good morning, Mr. Tshirt. Jennifer sang out as she turned back to the stove. Breakfast is ready if you are. Jennifer moved over to the table and set down a mug, filling it with coffee. I hope you don't mind. I saw you laid in a supply of recognizable food, and I was very careful not to move anything that I wasn't using. Once I clean up, you'll never know I was here. Zachariah retrieved a plate from the cupboard, filled it, and handed it to Bherdin with a wink. Best thing in the world to get your engine running. First thing in the morning. Tom had selected a few essentials, including the loan of his spare backup coffee machine. Bherdin ran a curious eye over the ingredients laid out. A bowl was filled with whisked eggs, while the potatoes had been diced up and fried. He looked at the cheese on the cutting board and considered the aroma again, comparing the fragrances to the ingredients. This does smell lovely. He settled in at the table and managed not to shudder when waving away the offer of coffee. I've educated myself on human food, but I'd not ventured into breakfast. If that's the case, ain't no time like the present for an introduction. Jen's a fine cook. She'll get you started on the right foot. Zachariah had already finished his plate and carried it toward the sink. Bherdin watched with relief as he placed it on the dish conveyor. Evidently, both were familiar with modern conveniences. If it's all the same to you both, I'm gonna head back to bed for a bit. I'm so dead beat, and I'm sure we're gonna have a busy day. Bherdin tried to hide his fascination at the unusual scene of familial bliss, playing out in his kitchen. Zachariah wrapped his arms around Jennifer's waist as she stood at the stove, and she kissed her husband lightly on the cheek. He then turned and, with a nod to Bherdin, headed toward the back of the house, leaving his wife in the kitchen. While oddly reversed, it stirred memories he'd set aside. You both speak excellent Vetica. Bherdin knew bacon as an ingredient for burgers, but it was interesting to find it served for breakfast. He tried the eggs tentatively, rolling the bite thoughtfully over his tongue. The flavour was delightful, and the texture rather fluffier than he'd expected. I'm surprised you aren't on local time, though. We were on a Rakiri ship. Our home's only a few hours different from capital time, but the ship's clock was on dirt time. Nice folks, but Zach's still feeling some lag. Jennifer had settled into Vedeem's usual chair and waved her mug toward her departed husband. Anyway, my husband works with your cousin, and we've practiced for a few years. I hope our accent isn't too bad? No, not at all. There was one, of course, but it wasn't awful. Thus far, her diction was flawless. Regardless, the first rule was to be a good host, and she was in his kitchen. If you're tired, I can clean up, Jennifer. I wouldn't dream of it, and please call me Jen. Anyway, we're early risers. Zach will adjust in no time, and it gave me a chance to snoop around your kitchen. I've seen some modern appliances in the settlement housing, of course, but there are things here I don't recognize. She replied with a warm smile, and glanced toward his counter. Zach has promised me one of those Rakiri vacuum cleaners, though. After all the months spent with Tom, Bherdin knew that roles were reversed on Earth, but it was still bemusing to see it in person. To find a wife being so domestic. Still, appliances were something of a passion, and despite his misgivings, he found himself warming to Jen. They do make the best. Bherdin hadn't been sure what sort of people the McClendons might be. Thry'sis had always been tenacious, and her disapproval of his life choices had rankled. The sort of human she might find common cause with had filled him with a nameless dread, and yet Zack had been polite, and Jen seemed easy. Particularly for a woman. Still, his curiosity bubbled under the surface. And my cousin's doing well, is she? She found her way after a while. Had a bit of a bumpy start, but to be fair all around, folks in town took some time too. Bherdin saw Jen's smile falter, but it rallied after a moment as she changed the subject. It's nice to sit down and just chat over breakfast. She told us a lot on the trip. I feel like I know you already. Bherdin swallowed his tea rather than choke on it. Another rule was to never look distressed in front of a guest, but there it was. Of course she had. Probably some fancifully edited version, but still. Thry'sis had always been relentless. She enjoyed it. Well, I'm an open book. If she wanted to ask, she'd ask. It had been inevitable, yet Jem seemed very likeable, and the breakfast was something he'd have to ask about. Recipes were sacred, a little quid pro quo never hurt. Hopefully Vedeem was having an easier time of things. Bherdin tucked in his robe and fortified himself. Ask what you will, dear. Vedeem had been careful to pack one of his best robes, so he didn't feel too dishevelled. The restaurant demanded late hours, so rising around mid-morning with father was a daily ritual. Bherdin always looked immaculate enough to receive the Empress, though it was a trick he hadn't mastered, and the knots in his back were reminding him that he hadn't slept in his own bed. The Pelavon house was gorgeous, though you could see it hadn't had a man's touch in years. Sure, Jen, talk to you soon. There were women in the kitchen. That was a recipe for disaster, and Vedeem hurried in to see if they needed anything. He blinked in some surprise to see his Valhaz co Liebhaberin, his third cousin, not by blood, by his father's cousin's co-wife, Riala, was eating at the kitchen table while her co-wife closed down her omnipad. Melody, not Melondi. Keeping those straight will be interesting. Remembering a guest's name was important, and even if this wasn't his own house, he was representing Shill, at least somewhat. The pair were obviously at ease with one another, but Riala had been away for years. She'd grown. He'd grown. Good morning. Vedeem tucked his robe sash tightly, feeling self-conscious, but hurried over to the counter to hide his blush. Can I get you anything? You must be famished. Oh, hey Vedeem. Riala waved her mug and grinned, pointing at the counter. We were having some tea and playing the game of Guess the Appliance. What is that thing? Vedeem glanced to where she'd pointed. The pippiya press? It's an artisanal model. Older, but very nice. I can have some ready in a few minutes. That would be great. Riala perked up. I saw some minced toroks and even some cellophare. Trust me, Mel, you haven't had a good papaya until you've had it with some chopped cellophare. You can't get it enough for love nor credits. Melody, looked at them both uncertainly, but Vedeem already had a mission and dug into the refrigerator with ease. He checked everything the day before, of course. It was important to make them feel at home, and he set out the ingredients, listening to the pair. Will there be more for breakfast? Probably free. Levi's already out taking the kids for a walk, but no idea about the others. Melody nodded. We're early risers, but I think Ree's family is all pretty wiped out. It was odd, listening to women sounding so domestic. Riala seemed at ease, and as for Melody, he had to turn down 2 offers to let her help chop the cellophare. He refused politely, of course. Consistency mattered for a good papaya mix, but it was disconcerting. He managed to get them both a fresh cup of tea when he worked through it to make sure, his third cousin's not by blood wife's sister, by his father's cousin's co-wife, padded into the kitchen. "Morning, everybody. Wow, the salad smells good." Hannah was in bare feet and a long nightshirt, and she stretched expansively. "Have you checked out the smart mirror in the bathroom? It's really cool, even if it defaults to purple skin. I mean, weird, but it's really prime glitch." "Make them feel at home, make them feel at home." Vedeem fought off another blush, though Hannah had only smiled at him, without so much as a glance toward his chest. He set another mug of tea out for her before hurrying back to check on the pappayas. "Weird, though, there aren't any monitors," Hannah said, blowing on the tea as it steamed. The papaya maker really was nice, and they were coming along fine. Despite feeling desperately underdressed, service came first, and that meant conversation. "There's one right there." He counted his head delicately to one side, pointing at the blank wall by the dining table. "Where?" The humans looked at the wall blankly. Riala groaned. "I forgot about that." Vedeem hurried over to the wall and raised 3 fingers to the ceiling. Giving a flick of his wrist, he swiped his thumb along his forefinger. The section of the wall illuminated, showing channel 26. "There." "Oh, wow! That's rad shwee!" Hannah sat up and Vedeem smiled, trying not to notice how thin her nightshirt was. It seemed like, whatever the world, women always needed someone to dress them. Hannah seemed lost in her own world, though. "How does it work? Is it something subdermal on your fingers?" "What?" Vedeem shook his head. "There are sensors in the ceiling. The first gesture is to alert the system, and the other gestures set the house controls. Everything from temperature to the wall textures." "You can change the wallpaper?" Melody asked uncertainly. "Wallpaper?" Vedeem repeated the words, trying to make sense of them. The kitchen had a fine view of the ocean, and it was set to a lovely pale cyan. He pointed to one wall and slid his thumb down his pinky, and the wall obligingly transitioned for a rainbow, before he set it on a nice Aureolian yellow. "Huh." Melody canted her head, staring at the wall for a moment, before giving an artful shrug and sipped at her tea again. Do you find that takes some of the fun out of redecorating?" "Redecorating nothing. You could watch life-size movies on the living room wall. Heck, you could play games on the ceiling without even leaving your bed." Hannah blew a strand of chestnut hair out of her eyes. "Goddess, I can't wait to see everything." "You can't see everything, goofball. We're only here for 3 weeks." Vedeem looked over as Jesserin entered the kitchen. He'd never met his third co-cousin before, but they were the same age. "Mother Thry'sis got her schedule, though, and goddess knows she's gonna try." Vedeem swallowed his tea and tried not to goggle. Jesserin was practically undressed. Jennifer found herself warming to Bherdin, though she had to admit she was curious. Bherdin and Thry'sis each seemed like bundles of energy, but it was definitely AC and DC. Thry'sis had planned everything out to the last detail, and Bherdin? Well, it was too early to tell much, but he had his own style, and seemed to run on raw nerves. Thry'sis did the same thing, but hers only showed when things came apart, like at the start of the trip. The first ship to get them to Shill hadn't exactly been a luxury starliner, but it was a perfectly good ship with a Rakiri crew. To hear Thry'sis, the accommodations were barely adequate, but it had been comfortable enough. Miara seemed to think so too, though she spent most of the time fretting over Lagos after that prank. "And I had to talk to Eli. Again." Even so, the Rakiri had been nice folks. The food had been unusual, and the meal was heavily favoured meat, but Zack and the boys hadn't complained. Everyone had muddled through, though Brellock had spent the whole trip looking nervous, as a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs. Still, they were here at least, and Bherdin hadn't been what she'd expected. She'd known Melshavanti were going to be different from Brelak, but comparing the two was like setting a penguin next to a peacock. Raised on Earth, Jassarin was a study in contrasts. At home in blue jeans and a t-shirt, Thry'sis privately despaired over the young Shrivanti man, and Lagos was just too young to lean in one direction or the other. Even so, Thry'sis hadn't been so far off the mark about her cousin. Bherdin put flair into everything, and she found herself hiding a smile. It boggled the mind to imagine Bherdin and Thry'sis together as kids, though their mothers had been close. What felt odd was the way Bherdin gave up details of his life. He didn't sigh, but you think someone had shot the cat. She listened to his life story with a growing sense of disbelief. So you had an arranged marriage? From a social club?
Not arranged, dear. No, that's pedestrian. It was negotiated. The establishment where I gained my credentials made me a sensation as a chef, and I was able to write my own ticket.
Bherdin waved the notion away airily, but leaned in with a conspiratorial smile.
I was swept off my feet by my Eloise, though. She was so dashing. A new captain in the Marines, but from a respectable family. I thought I had it all, even though Aurada insisted I should wait. But Aurada was the new manager, and I thought I knew best.
Bherdin sighed, gazing wistfully into the distance. Juliet on her balcony would have been envious.
Just between us, perhaps I should have listened there, but I was so very young.
If you don't mind my asking, what happened? Jennifer bit her lip, trying to feel her way through the conversation. It seemed only fair to know who they were dropping in on, but Thry'sis never said much when she asked. She said you never remarried. I thought that was pretty uncommon.
And me, an unmarried man? I'm sure Thry'sis told you all about the scandal, but it was nothing tawdry.
Bherdin touched his hand to his chest, delicately.
And I decided for myself, you know.
Honestly, I didn't. She seemed rather reluctant to say much at all the entire trip. Jennifer offered tentatively, the feeling of family history stretching out in front of her like a minefield. Or a church social.
Oh? Well, that's unexpected. I suppose it was the scandal afterward that made her pucker up, not the marriage itself.
Bherdin deflated a bit before drawing a deep breath.
Thry'sis was willing to overlook how we met, but only as long as it brought me a successful wife from a good family. She had no problem with my marrying old money and turned a blind eye to how.
He sniffed before taking a long sip of his tea.
No, the problems came later, after my wife was killed in deployment.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Jen sought for the right words. The invasion hadn't touched many of the people she knew, but there were still some. Was she on Earth?
Oh.
Bherdin touched her arm briefly and shook his head.
No, dear, please don't fret about that. She was killed during a deployment against those Val Unus, and I was left to raise Vedeem alone. It turned out her family was utterly scandalized by our marriage, and they were no help at all. Which scandalized Thry'sis all the more, if you can imagine. I was solid goods, dear.
Over the years, Jennifer had come to know Thry'sis pretty well. As she put the pieces into place, they didn't stretch the imagination too much. And you didn't want to remarry? She took another cautious, conversational step, testing the minefield.
I've been a prize once. I had my career, no one to tell me what to do, and a son to raise,
Bherdin said forthrightly, straightening the lapels of his satin robe.
I'd been a prize once, and it's not easy to be a man in the woman's world. I know my life has been less than traditional, but I have absolutely no regrets.
Jennifer thought of the many times she and Zach had similar conversations about Gary Hawthorne and how she'd watched Melody and Chloe grow up. She hadn't heard so much as a word out of Bherdin's son, but there hadn't been time.
But enough about me.
Bherdin waved a hand as he smiled warmly.
Are you and your husband considering another Mrs. McClellan while you're here? My old club is just fabulous for...
Another rule of good service was proper emergency care. Jennifer was no longer choking on her tea when a loud yawn came from the corridor, and Thry'sis trudged into the kitchen. "Is there tea?" There were dark rings under her eyes, but she clutched her omnipad with an air of determination. "You shouldn't have let me sleep in. It's almost 10 and we have things to do." Trinia Dal Rickon looked over the breakfast table, with its empty places, and sighed. She'd miss this room, with its quiet simplicity, and the view out over the estate. The months aboard the flagship had been trying, and while it had boasted amenities enough to indulge the court, there was no way it could compare with the joys of home. If only coming home had been so easy. The table was set, as expected, and the staff had her favourites ready. Laurel's as well, though her husband lay alone in his bedchamber. The news had devastated him, and he was still inconsolable. At least the Admiral had the good sense to present the news to them both in the privacy of their staterooms. She jotted a note down on her omnipad. While Laurel had taken all her energy over the last few days, it wasn't too late to send a message to thank the woman for her consideration. Privacy was in short supply, but the Admiral had ensured they remained undisturbed. She gazed over at the space where Aurelia's chair had been, and the smaller space where Satora always ate. The staff had removed them both. "And a note thanking the staff. There will be enough reminders as it is." Still, things had to be taken care of, and as the woman of the house, it fell to her. Not that I'd have it any other way. Kamaud're had been so utterly obtuse. Dealing with Kamaud're had always been a trial, but she'd known that marrying a Tessu wouldn't be easy. Her mothers had tried to brace her for the worst, though in truth, she'd known it all beforehand. Kamaud're had all the sensitivity of a brick, and you didn't need much time with the family to notice. Not that the woman didn't provide everyone with constant reminders. Aurelia and Satora are both dead, and she's barely said a word to Laurel, she thought darkly. Counting her Preltha already, no doubt. One mention of an Efrovi celebration in the royal family's honour, and she was already off. Laurel would need time, and so much care. At least Prendy was safe, thank all the goddesses. She would need to be a rock for them both in the days ahead. Doubtless, Kamaud're was already settling at home, oblivious to her brother's pain. No matter, Kamaud're was her own worst enemy. Laurel and Prendy need me, more than ever. I have a family to take care of. Breakfast had been promptly served by her staff, with the pippiya toasted just the right shade of brown, and Kamaud're wiped the last crumbs from her tusk delicately. It was nearly 10 in the morning, after all. A civilized time to wake up and begin one's day. She pushed the plate away after folding the napkin, and left the steward to his work. On any other day, one might have dallied to consider the boy, but there were things that had to be done. So much work and so little time. Sauntering through her chambers into her offices, she spared her secretary a lingering glance. Piran was back at his desk and looking tasty as ever. One really should reward him properly once things settled back in. He'd been invaluable during the trip and was such a dear. Still, there was a time and place for everything, and the day was wasting away intolerably. Some things simply had to be done before noon. Settling in at her desk, she looked about the room. Everything appeared to be in order, and she touched her desk omni, calming Piran. The look of the thing was important with subordinates, even the tasty ones. Piran, be a dear. We will see Agent Zariva now we are properly composed. At once, Your Royal Highness. Piran's response was prompt as ever, and she did so enjoy the emphasis his voice lent to royal. She composed herself at her desk, and waited. Levi smiled, as Largos and Joshua chased each other around the knobby half-sphere that rose up out in the middle of the playground. The fountains on the splash pad weren't active, Not that anyone would be likely to miss them in the crisp fall air. Levi himself had left the house with a flannel overshirt, but after chasing the two boys around the playground for a few minutes while carrying Cassandra, he had opted to tie it around his waist. Steam still rolled off his t-shirt as he caught his breath, and his daughter burbled happily in his arms. "Stay out of the mud, you two." He shook his head and hid a smile as the two boys froze, then darted back toward the center of the playground. By far, the most remarkable thing about the playground equipment was how familiar it all looked. The scale was a bit bigger than what you could expect to find in public parks scattered across the Duchy of North America, but a slide seemed to be a universal constant. There was even a fireman's pole. How utterly impertinent! Levi turned to see a Shrivanti woman scowling at him from the sidewalk. She was bundled up against the cold, with stray wisps of salt and pepper hair poking out from beneath a fur cap. Levi glanced around, but there wasn't anyone there but him and the children. "I'm sorry?" "As well you should be." The woman gestured vaguely at him as she stalked forward. "A man, alone with children, and flaunting yourself like some kind of streetwalker." Levi looked down at himself. "I am? What other possible reason would you have to leave your arms bare in this cold?" "I was warm." She scoffed. "And what of your safety, What of the safety of the children?" Levi's brow furrowed. "Ma'am, are you telling me that a man and his children are not safe on the roads of Shill?" She paused only briefly, mouth agape, before barreling onward. "Of course they would be safe. It's the principle of the thing that concerns me." She shook an admonitory finger under his nose. "I know what your kind is up to, young man. Corrupting the youth, seducing naive young women, and mocking the notion of family. Gnawing at the very foundation of our great empire. I saw that appalling excuse for a wedding that they displayed. My entire yacht club has been talking about it, and I won't have it. I simply won't." "Well, Levi blinked under the verbal onslaught and glanced over his shoulder again to check on the boys. "That one my son is, and that one my nephew is, so no street walking or youth corrupting going on here." "Nephew indeed!" She gave a harumph that, back on Earth, would have heralded a damaged flower bed or mud tracked on the carpet. "I should inform Her Majesty's Ministry of the Interior of the neglect being perpetuated under their very noses." "The Interior?" Levi's fists clenched. "Is that a fact, ma'am?" "It is." The woman gave him a curt nod. "It's obviously high time you learned that actions have consequences. Now, what is your name?" You want me to give you my name?" Levi's eyebrows rose. "And you're going to give it to the Interior?" Yes, you stupid boy. Your name." Levi rubbed his chin in thought. "Well, it's a human name. I do not know how you spell it, and is maybe a little hard to pronounce." She regarded him with an expression of long suffering. "I'm certain I shall have no problem with a single name, you ill-educated rapscallion. I can barely stand to hear you speak Vatican with that reprehensible accent." "Right, of course, and I do apologize. I've seen the error of my ways, and I will make sure to stop all further mockery and gnawing." "You're trying my patience, you wretched savage." She raised an eyebrow. "Your name, boy, your name." "As you say, ma'am, but since you're demanding mine, should not I have yours?" "Very well. I'm Dame Costellas of the noble house of Guelph, and it's just as well that you who's correcting your scurrilous, human indiscretions on our very streets." She sniffed, waggling a finger under his nose again. "Now, I demand that you give me your name at once." "Right." Levi pursed his lips and nodded. "It's pronounced Gofak Youssef." Kamaud're waited patiently until Agent Halame Jasreen closed the door and counted to 6 before she let loose a shriek of outrage. Her offices were soundproofed, and one could give full vent to one's feelings if one so chose. There was only so much one could stand. The nerve! Zariva was gone, vanished, missing without a trace. Even her underling, Weifao, was gone, transferred without explanation, though there wasn't a place in the galaxy she could go where she wouldn't be found. This was a plot, and there was no doubt it was all against oneself. Quietly transferred out of the palace without comment, nor even a missive from Minister Raylin, leaving her with Agent Jesreen. The woman was a nobody. She had only arrived days ago and knew nothing of the inner workings of the Northern Palace. She was barely even from a reliable family, much less one with the appropriate prominence to carry out one's orders. It was an intolerable slight. No, this could only be meant to embarrass and undermine, and Kamaud're seethed. She had a celebration to prepare. Her time in the sun, conducting Ifrovi for a grateful shill, there to be seen by one and all, and she was being supported by menials. Still, there was some respite. One had one's training from the interior, and no matter how deeply one's enemies tried to bury the traces, someone would know what became of Caldera Seriva. Someone would know where Arisa Weifao had gone. One could squeeze the information from Weifao once she was found, and if Weifao didn't know, one would continue until one found out. Yes, that was for the best. Like a garden, some things just needed time to come to flower. Some things could not be rushed, and one had to consider the ebb and flow of the tide before setting a course. And one did have a party to plan. The end to the time of mourning, all over her dearly departed, dull, insipid sister, Kamaud're. No, the only proper response now that she was home was to remain the dutiful daughter, and one would do so, with all the nods to the public that duty demanded. Certainly there would have to be nods to Kamaud're, galling as that was, but Aurelea and her daughter would play their parts as well. One's family had suffered a tragedy, after all. It was only right to capitalize on it, putting on a brave face as the people put their grief behind them. And it could be such a wonderful Ifrovi, properly guided by one's personal touch. The public would see that as well. Yes, one would suffer in private for them, nobly putting on a brave face. Kamaud're reached out and touched her desk omni, feeling more composed. Piran, come at once. One has misses to dictate. There was so much to be done. But first, a private dinner with Loral and his bitch of a wife, along with young Kalira. Breakfast was long over, as the Rem Railing considered her orders. Ensconced in her office, the Minister of Interior seldom left, certainly not since the fleet had returned. The agent who returned with the court had been one of her most trusted. The orders on the table had been delivered by hand. The Empress remained away, but the letter left no doubt about her will. Lorem considered the dispatch warily, before casting it into the shredder. The operative looked over the news with a sense of satisfaction before closing off the screen. She had carefully avoided having a reputation. Reputations were liabilities. As long as the big fish could hire you, that's all you needed. And as much as she'd hated waiting, the credits were too good to miss. Besides, this was her final job. She would disappear into the Alliance with a fake name, buy a new identity once she arrived, and then move again. Some reasonably plush little world far from the Imperium, where she'd have more money than a goddess, living the rest of her days in utter luxury. A modest goal, but it was hers. Her second target was back, at last, along with the woman who was paying dearly for the work. She would deliver the best. Just one shot was all that she'd need. Then it was off to the Alliance with credits in hand, and she'd be gone, gone, gone.